Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, the origins of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible.
That's right.
For literally centuries, the cornerstone belief has been, well, that Moses wrote it all, every single word.
It's a very powerful tradition.
But what if that tradition bumps up against the text itself? Or, the historical picture?
Exactly. It's a fascinating area because when you start digging the evidence from textual analysis, from history, it tells a slightly different, maybe more complex story.
And that's our goal today, right? To take the sources you've gathered, unpack this complex academic stuff, and give you, our listener, a real shortcut to understanding it.
We want to offer those aha moments, those insights that leave you feeling genuinely well-informed about where this incredibly influential text likely came from.
So we'll look at what the text doesn't say, some internal puzzles, a big scholarly idea called the documentary hypothesis.
And the historical challenges, too.
Yeah.
Plus, why Moses got the credit in the first place. It's quite a story in itself.
It absolutely is. All right, let's dive in. Eyes. The Pentateuch's textual anonymity. The first clue. Okay, first stop. This might actually be surprising for a lot of people. The common image, the one we sort of absorb, is Moses on the mountain, right? Receiving dictation, writing it all down.
That's the picture, yeah. Solitary prophet scribe.
But if you actually go to the Torah, does it anywhere say, Moses wrote this book?
Well, that's the striking thing. It doesn't, not for the whole 5 books.
Yeah.
Moses is consistently talked about in the third person. He's a major character in the story.
So he's treated like, well, like Abraham or Jacob, a part of the narrative.
Exactly. Now, the text does say he wrote specific things down, like certain laws, maybe a song, some records.
Okay.
But those are specific, limited instances. As Monica Bajic puts it, there is no place in the Pentateuch where Moses is explicitly stated to be the author of the 5 books. That silence is pretty significant.
It really is. And the clearest, maybe the most impossible to ignore example is right at the end, isn't it? Deuteronomy 34.
Oh, absolutely. The death of Moses.
Yeah. It describes his death, his burial, how he was honored after his death. It's all in the past tense.
Written from the perspective of someone looking back.
And it even says, no one knows his burial place to this day.
That phrase, "to this day," that tells you time has passed. The writer is living later. Moses couldn't have penned his own obituary and reflected on his legacy like that.
Right. And this wasn't missed by early commentators either, was it?
Not at all. Even traditional Jewish sources, like the Talmud, they record debates among rabbis about this very passage.
What did they suggest?
Well, some wondered if Joshua, his successor, wrote those final verses. Others offered more mystical ideas, like Moses wrote it prophetically, maybe with tears, knowing his death was coming.
Which shows they recognize the problem, the tension there.
It absolutely highlights that underlying tension. They were trying to reconcile the text with the tradition.
And it's probably fair to say that back then, the whole idea of authorship wasn't quite like our modern obsession with knowing exactly who wrote what.
That's a very good point. Authority often came from the sacredness, the community accepting it as inspired, not necessarily from a named author signing off on it.
So this lack of an explicit claim, this textual anonymity,
It opens the door to thinking that maybe Mosaic authorship is more about later tradition than the original text's intention. 2. Contradictions and anachronisms. Unveiling multiple hands.
Okay, so the text doesn't explicitly claim Moses wrote it all. Now, what happens when we look inside the text? You'd think a single author, especially someone like Moses, would produce something, well, seamless, consistent.
That would be the expectation, yes. A coherent narrative, maybe a unified style.
But that's not quite what we find, is it? Scholars point out repetitions, stories told twice with different details, contradictions, even things that seem out of place historically.
Right, these aren't just tiny hiccups. They're significant enough that they make the idea of a single author, specifically Moses writing in his time, functionally impossible, as some put it.
We already mentioned the big one, narrating your own death.
That's the most obvious, yeah. But there's more. Think about Genesis 36, verse 31. It lists kings who ruled in Edom before any king ruled over the Israelites.
So that writer knows about the future Israelite monarchy.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which didn't start for centuries after Moses was supposedly alive. The author is clearly writing retrospectively, looking back after kings were established in Israel.
That's a clear anachronism, something out of its proper time. Are there others, like geographical ones?
There are. Genesis 14 mentions Abraham chasing enemies as far as Dan.
Dan, okay.
But the place only got named Dan much later, during the time of the judges, long after Abraham.
So it's like writing a story about Julius Caesar and having him visit New York City.
Exactly. These retrojections of geographic names, as scholars call them, show editorial work happening much, much later than Moses.
And this brings us to those repeated stories, the doublets you mentioned.
Yes, this is really compelling evidence. Take the creation accounts, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2.
Right, everyone knows those. Very different feel.
Completely different. Genesis 1 is cosmic, structured. God creates by speaking, 6 days. Genesis 2 is earthier, more narrative. God forms man from dust, woman from a rib.
Different order of creation, too, different vocabulary. Even how God is portrayed seems different.
Different theological emphasis. Then you have the wife-sister stories.
Oh, yeah, where Abraham passes Sarah off as his sister twice.
And then Isaac does the same thing with Rebekah.
It feels like variations on a theme.
Classic signs, scholars say, of multiple authors or redacted traditions merged into one narrative. Someone was weaving together different versions.
What else? The flood.
The flood, yes. One part says bring 2 of every animal. Another says 7 pairs of the clean ones. It's slightly different instructions.
And even the 10 Commandments.
Even those. They appear in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, but with noticeable variations in the wording and reasons given for the Sabbath, for instance. Again, suggesting different traditions being recorded.
And the way God is described can shift quite dramatically too, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes God seems very human-like, walking in the garden, even regretting making humanity in Genesis 6.
Anthropomorphic.
Yes. And other times, God is utterly transcendent, distant, revealed through strict rituals and laws. These aren't contradictions easily explained by one author's mood swings. They reflect evolving theological conceptions over time.
So when you put all these pieces together, the death narrative, the anachronisms, the doublets, the theological shifts.
They're not just minor details. They really are like structural fractures. They only start to make sense if you see the Torah not as a single block, but as a layered document, compiled over a long period by different hands, different editors or redactors. 3. The documentary hypothesis, a powerful explanatory framework.
Okay, so all these clues, the anonymity, the internal wrinkles, the contradictions, they practically scream multiple sources. And this led scholars to do some serious literary detective work, didn't it?
It really did. And one of the most influential outcomes of that work is what's known as the documentary hypothesis.
Right, the DH. Can you break that down for us? What's the core idea?
Well, the basic idea is that the Pentateuch, as we have, wasn't written by one person, but it's actually a skillful combination weaving together of several older independent documents or sources.
So like different streams flowing into one river.
That's a good analogy. And scholars traditionally identified 4 main streams or sources, usually known by letters, J, E, D, and P.
J, E, D, P. Okay, what distinguishes them?
So J stands for the Yahweh source. It generally prefers the name YHWH for God, often translated as Lord. It's known for its vivid anthropomorphic stories, like God walking in Eden, often associated with the southern kingdom of Judah.
Okay, J is Yahwist, anthropomorphic, Judah. Got it. What about E?
E is the Elohist. It prefers the name Elohim for God, especially early on. It tends to be more focused on moral themes, prophecy, maybe dreams as communication from God, often linked to the northern kingdom of Israel.
Elohist, Elohim, Northern Kingdom, moral focus.
Okay.
Day.
D is for Deuteronomist. This source is primarily found in the book of Deuteronomy, but its themes influence other parts too. It really emphasizes covenant faithfulness, obedience to the law, and importantly, the idea of centralized worship, only worshiping God in Jerusalem.
Ah, so Deuteronomy's distinct style and message points to a specific source.
Yes, often connected to the reforms under King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. And finally, P, the priestly source. This one is very concerned with order, genealogies, liturgical details, laws about ritual purity, the Sabbath, the tabernacle. God is portrayed as majestic, transcendent. Think of the structured creation in Genesis 1.
Lots of lists and rituals.
Exactly. And P is often thought to have taken its final shape later, perhaps during or after the Babylonian exile, reflecting the concerns of the priesthood in rebuilding the community around temple practices.
Wow, so JEDP. 4 distinct voices or traditions. How does this hypothesis help with those contradictions we talked about?
It makes perfect sense of them. Those doublets, like the 2 creation stories or the different flood accounts, they're not mistakes.
Nope.
They're likely the result of a later editor, a redactor, taking the J version and the P version, or the J and the E, and weaving them together. Trying to preserve both valued traditions, even if they didn't perfectly align. It's like editorial stitching.
So you see the seams,
You
basically.
see the seams and the different names for God, YHWH and Elohim? That's not just random. It often correlates with these different sources, revealing competing understandings, or at least different emphasis, regarding God's nature and relationship with humanity.
Which would be really hard to explain if it was just one author writing straight through.
Extremely hard. The DH suggests these sources reflect different historical moments, different theological concerns. P, responding to the exile. D, reflecting Josiah's reforms. It shows an evolution.
So the big takeaway from the documentary hypothesis is
That the Pentateuch is probably not the work of one mind. It's the incredible product of a long and complex literary evolution. It's less a single statue, more like a sacred tapestry woven from many threads over many generations. And that complexity, that layering, actually gives it incredible depth. 4. Linguistic and historical challenges beyond the text.
okay, so we've looked at the text itself, its silence on authorship, its internal complexities, and a framework like the documentary hypothesis to explain them. Now let's step outside the text for a bit. Let's look at language and history.
Right, broadening the lens.
And a really basic, practical question comes up. The language itself, Hebrew. Would Moses, raised in the Egyptian court according to the Bible, have written in Hebrew?
That's a very pointed question. The story says he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That would mean Egyptian scripts, hieroglyphs, hieratic.
Not the kind of Hebrew we see in the Torah.
Not really. Proto-Hebrew existed, but the developed Hebrew of the Pentateuch, its grammar, its style, it looks much more like the Hebrew used centuries later, especially around the time of the monarchy or even the post-exilic period. Linguistically, it doesn't quite fit the supposed time of Moses.
Interesting. Okay, what about external evidence? History, archaeology? Does Egyptian history mention this huge event, the Exodus?
Well, that's another major challenge. Egypt in the New Kingdom period, when the Exodus is traditionally dated, kept pretty detailed records. We have inscriptions, papyri, administrative lists.
Lots of stuff.
Lots of stuff. But there is simply no known inscription, papyrus, or artifact from Egypt that mentions a figure named Moses leading Israelites, or the plagues as described, or a massive departure of slaves.
Complete silence.
Total silence from the Egyptian side. Now, arguments from silence are tricky, but for an event supposedly so catastrophic for Egypt, it's a very conspicuous silence. As the sources state, no independent Near Eastern source from the 2nd millennium BCE corroborates the biblical account.
Wow. And then there are the numbers involved in the Exodus story.
Yes, the sheer scale described in the Pentateuch. It mentions over 600,000 men of fighting age.
Which implies, what, 2-3 million people total?
At least 2 to 3 million people leaving Egypt and wandering the desert. Demographically, that's highly improbable.
Why?
Well, estimates put the entire population of Egypt at that time around maybe 3 to 4 million. Losing 2 million people, especially slaves, would have utterly devastated the Egyptian economy.
It would be like half the population leaving.
Something like that.
Yeah.
An event of that magnitude would surely leave some trace in Egyptian records or the archaeological record, yet we find none.
And just the logistics. Feeding and watering millions in the Sinai desert for 40 years.
The logistical challenge is immense, and archaeologically, there has been no archaeological discovery of large campsites, trails, or waste deposits in the Sinai that would correspond to such a massive, prolonged migration. We find evidence of small nomadic groups, yes, but nothing on the scale the Bible describes. Okay, so linguistic issues, lack of external corroboration, demographic and logistical impossibilities. Anything else from the historical side? Just reinforcing what we touched on earlier with anachronisms, the text mentions things like the established monarchy, the specific naming of the city of Dan, perhaps details related to the later temple cult. These reflect political and social realities long after Moses' time.
That retrospective view again.
Exactly. It all aligns much more closely with the concerns and the worldview of later periods, particularly the monarchy and the post-exilic era, rather than the 13th century BCE or earlier.
So, putting the linguistic and historical evidence together.
It makes the traditional view of Mosaic authorship, writing during the Exodus, historically and linguistically untenable for many scholars. It strongly supports the idea that the Exodus narrative, while central theologically, is likely more of a foundational myth or theological construction than a straightforward historical report. V. Religious and political motivations. The sacred fiction.
All right, this leads us to the big so what. If the evidence leans away from Moses as the sole author who did put the Torah together, and maybe more importantly, why attribute it to Moses?
This is where we get into the fascinating why behind it all. Modern scholarship doesn't necessarily point to one single author replacing Moses, but more towards a process, probably culminating with post-exilic editors or redactors.
After the Babylonian exile.
Yes, during the Persian period, when the Jewish community was rebuilding in Jerusalem, a key figure often highlighted is Ezra the scribe.
Ezra, tell us about him.
The Bible itself describes Ezra, in the book of Ezra, as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses. He comes to Jerusalem with the backing of the Persian king, tasked with teaching and implementing this law. He even holds a public reading of it, described in Nehemiah.
So he's clearly associated with the law.
Very strongly. Many scholars see him, or perhaps a circle of scribes around him, as playing a central role in compiling the final form of the Pentateuch, bringing together those older sources, J, E, D, and P, into the coherent whole we roughly have today.
Okay, so Ezra and his team might be the final editors, but why attribute their work, or this compilation, to Moses, who lived centuries earlier?
Authority. Legitimacy. Think about the context. The community is fragile, rebuilding after a devastating exile, surrounded by foreign powers and influences. They need unity, a clear identity.
And Moses provides that.
Moses is the foundational figure, the ultimate symbol of divine revelation, leadership, and law. Attributing the compiled law to him gave it unparalleled weight, divine sanction. It wasn't just Ezra's rules, it was the law of Moses, received from God.
So it anchors their present struggles and reforms in a sacred, authoritative past.
Precisely. And this insistence on Mosaic authorship wasn't necessarily there from the very beginning in the same way. It seems to have solidified and become more emphasized over time, especially in reaction to polemical needs. Meaning, when defending their tradition against challenges from internal sects, later from Christians who had their own interpretations, and eventually Muslims, claiming direct Mosaic, divine authorship became a crucial boundary marker of orthodoxy for Rabbinic Judaism. It asserted the Torah's unique status and inerrancy.
So it served a theological and political purpose in shaping identity and responding to others.
Yes, and this isn't necessarily about deliberate deception in the way we might think of it today. It's more like Ezra and his circle retrojected his own religious vision into the sacred past, lending it the authority of divine antiquity.
Giving current needs a sacred origin story.
Exactly. Many ancient cultures created founding myths this way. They were authored long after the events they described as a means of giving present realities a sacred origin. It's about crafting a unifying narrative rooted in the most revered figure possible.
So the attribution to Moses itself becomes part of the story, a kind of sacred myth or theological frame.
That's a good way to put it. A frame designed to hold together a scattered people, giving them a shared, divinely ordained foundation based on the ultimate lawgiver, Moses. Less a historical footnote, more a theological statement about the law's enduring power and origin. Outro.
Wow. Okay, let's try and wrap our heads around all this. We've covered quite a bit in this deep dive.
We certainly have.
We started with the text itself, noting it doesn't actually claim Moses wrote it all, that surprising anonymity.
Then the internal clues, the contradictions, the anachronisms, the doublets suggesting multiple hands at work.
Right, which led us to the documentary hypothesis, JEDP, as a powerful model for explaining how those multiple voices might have come together.
Then we stepped outside the text, looking at the linguistic challenges, the lack of historical or archaeological corroboration for a massive exodus.
And the sheer logistical hurdles.
Exactly. And finally, we explored the why, the crucial role of figures like Ezra, the need for authority in the post-exilic period, and how attributing the final compilation to Moses served powerful religious and political needs.
So what's the big takeaway for someone listening? Does realizing Moses likely didn't write the whole Torah diminish it somehow?
You know, for many people, including any scholars of faith, it actually does the opposite. Recognizing the human fingerprints all over the text, the different voices, the editing, the tensions, the historical layers, it doesn't have to make it less sacred.
How so?
It can make it more meaningful, not less. It shifts the view from, say, a perfect static monument dictated once to something maybe even more profound. A living record of human divine encounter.
A living record.
Yeah, crafted by a real community across centuries. A community that struggled, remembered, reimagined, and believed, and recorded that journey in this incredible text.
So maybe the provocative thought to leave our listeners with is this. What changes if we see a sacred text not as a monologue from one person, but as a dialogue across generations?
An evolving voice of many searching for God. What new things might we learn? What different kinds of richness might we find if we engage with it as that sacred tapestry, not a static monument?
Something definitely worth thinking about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.